Thanks, everyone. So we're going to get started. My name is Steve Patrick. I'm Vice President and Executive Director of the Forum for Community Solutions at the Aspen Institute, and a proud co-conspirator with FSG and Sherry Brady and everybody else on this CI forum work. So we have a great privilege tonight in this fireside chat. So first, let's pretend there are windows in the room and we're looking out at the beautiful sunny Puget Sound. Second, let's pretend there's a fire by our side. And third, let's have a great conversation. To frame this up a little bit, I think folks will remember, some of you were there, some of you may have watched it online, but when we all convened the Collective Impact Forum Funder Community of Practice in New Orleans last year, we had the great opportunity to have Angela Glover Blackwell speak about equity and collective impact. And part of the theme on that, and then there were a lot of breakout sessions and conversations about it, was, the frame of the 5 core elements of collective impact are fantastic, but in hindsight, and John and Mark deserve a lot of credit for sort of always being about continuous improvement, and FSG and all of us in this field. In hindsight, I think we need to lift up that frame of equity much more clearly in this work. So the way we thought about the New Orleans meeting was that was going to be the stake in the ground moment for equity. That is to say, if you are aligning systems that already have, for example, structural racism baked into them, then what the heck is the point, right? So how do you do this work around equity? And Angela gave us a great kind of call to action around equity. The other thing that I think comes up a lot around the collective impact frame is community, constituent voice, community participation. We all know how valuable and vital that is. Many of us would agree that you're not going to get to the right outcomes if the community is not helping to determine what those are, that you're not going to have the right framework if the community is not at the center of that conversation and at the table. But it is fair to argue that in a community, the superintendent of schools, the mayor, the community college president, the workforce board chair could all get together and say, now we are doing collective impact, and begin their work. And in fact, that would not reflect constituent voice. That would not reflect community voice. That would not reflect authentic engagement of the very folks whose lives you're trying to influence and impact by doing the hard, deep work of collective impact. So I think this year, I would posit to you that the stake in the ground on this stage, right here, right now, to complement the equity stake in the ground from last year, soon we'll have a bigger tent, is a stake in the ground around community and civic engagement, civic voice, constituent participation, constituent ownership of the work. And there are no two Seattleites who I could think of who have a better sense of balancing, high-level stakeholders, electeds, former White House executives, with the voice of community than Mayor Norm Rice and Eric Liu. So I'm excited to kick into a conversation with these guys. I was going to say their bios are in your book, but we ran out of money at the Collective Impact Forum, so we didn't put their bios in the book. Thankfully, you're a room full of foundations, so I think that can be solved. But here's what I do know from a little bit of prep work for this conversation. They both have Wikipedia pages. Welcome to Seattle, welcome to the modern era.
What?
You have, Norm, you have a Wikipedia page. Okay. So look them up on Wikipedia. It's really cool, actually. You can get their whole bio. Some of you are doing it right now. That's cool. I anticipate some awesome tweets that come out of that, like, who knew Eric Liu played the cello?
Violin.
Violin. Who knew Eric Liu played the violin? I'll stop there. Look them up on Wikipedia. The conversation with these gentlemen is about community voice. It's about how do we think about the frame of collective impact, and then how do we make sure that community is at the center of this conversation of the shared collaborative work that gets to metric change in our communities. So let me just turn it over to either of you. Why don't we start with you, Eric? You know a fair amount about the collective impact movement. How would you answer this question? How would you help us put a stake in the ground around community engagement, civic engagement, community voice in this work?
Well, first of all, thank you. It's great to be on this stage with you guys, and great to be in this room with all of you. I do know the collective impact movement in part, in no small part, because I share an office with the collective impact movement, or a good chunk of it. Our friends at FSG, and Steve and I also share an office as well. You know, I guess I would say a couple things about your framework there. And for those of you who haven't gone to Wikipedia yet, the one thing I'll say about the work that I do, so you have a little context, I run an organization called Citizen University, and our work is fundamentally about trying to democratize understanding of power, how power operates in civic life. And so when I think when you describe the ways in which at last year's convening the stake got put in the ground around equity and so forth, I think that's great. And this year you want to really put a stake in the ground about voice and about engagement and bottom-up community engagement. I think that's also great. But I think while those are necessary, they are still not sufficient. I think there has to be a stake in the ground, or a real explicit unflinching look at power, being able and willing to name power. Inequities of power, you know, when we talk about equity, what we really mean is inequity. And when we talk about inequity, what we really mean is inequity of power. And I don't think we should kind of pussyfoot around that, right? There are inequities of voice, inequities of money, inequities of knowledge, inequities of clout, inequities of connections, and they radiate out in a community. And so if you want to be serious about collective action, collective impact as a strategy, in the first place, you have to be willing and able to name power and to name the imbalances in power and to name the ways that you want to remedy those imbalances, right? I think that's, and on one level, everybody knows that, but on another level, I think, as you say, as a movement comes together and as this, you know, and it gets its own language, as the collective impact movement has, it's super important when it's still relatively early, as it is now in the life of a movement, that you bake in this intentional focus on power, right? I think at every scale, I mean, forget about Washington, D.C., or even a city hall. If you just think about the life of a neighborhood, and you feel the texture of that neighborhood, and you think about who has capital in that neighborhood. And it could be actual financial capital. It could be reputational capital, you know. Someone's got a reputation of either being the go-to fixer guy, or a reputation of being the guy you don't want to mess with, you know, maybe because you fear for your own safety, or maybe the reputation of the healer or the bridge builder. But who has what kinds of capital in a neighborhood, right? And I think all of us who take collective impact seriously have to look not only bottom up, but be looking with that lens on, right? What is the topography of power at the neighborhood level? And from that, I can actually begin to think about how I would hit those 5 core marks of collective impact, and, you know, do the tactical things that one needs to do.
I kind of go from a different standpoint. There's a line that I like very much. Some people would rather you hear their complaint than solve their problems. And those who try to develop collective impact and create the civic engagement need to keep that in mind. And most people, maybe you don't know my background, I had run for mayor and lost, ran for Congress and lost. And I was almost ready to believe that nobody loved me. And there became an initiative that took over Seattle to repeal busing in the city of Seattle, to repeal it. And it was very contentious, as you can gather, was very angry, and one of the candidates running for mayor had decided that that was going to be the cornerstone of his election campaign. And because I had lost, I was waiting for somebody else to step up and speak and say, this is bad public policy, this is the wrong thing to do. And I kept waiting and waiting, and nobody stepped up. So literally, about 7 hours before the deadline, I filed for mayor and jumped into the race, saying that we don't need that in Seattle. I won. The initiative to repeal busing in the city of Seattle passed. So I always said that the voters got to vote their hopes and their fears. They feared busing, so they voted against it, and they hoped that I could fix it. And what we did in the city of Seattle, which is bear in mind what Eric has said, we came together and realized we needed to create a summit. We needed to bring the citizens of Seattle together to begin to redefine where they were going to go and how we wanted to go. And we learned a lot from that effort in the sense of civic engagement, listening to people, understanding where they are, and really creating that kind of feedback loop. You said this, we heard this, is this what you said? The validation, the kind of process. And we came up, the initiative, and I'll make it kind of brief, but the initiative said that until busing is repealed in the city of Seattle, all funds that the city had to go into the school district would be held in escrow until they repealed it. So there were no monies for a lot of programs. So that division was even greater. So we came up with an idea to create the Family and Education Levy. But before that, we convened the citizens of Seattle over 2 days to begin to have a dialogue over what they wanted out of education. And I always tell everybody, got to make sure you ask the right question. How can we make our children succeed? Not how can you solve busing, not what's wrong with it, but really talking about it. And we hired facilitators. We really began to teach people how to listen and to really create a climate where the anger that we had could be dissipated into strategic visioning moving forward. And out of that whole effort came an initiative that the city of Seattle, just so you know, the busing initiative passed, the money was held in escrow, people needed money. So the city of Seattle came up with a bond issue called the Family and Education Levy. And all those dialogues that we had with people, it was to make every child safe, healthy, and ready to learn. So we were able to allocate dollars to the school district to replace the money that was held in escrow so that we could begin to move forward. And we stopped the anger and started looking about the investments where we were going to go. And that became kind of the cornerstone of my administration, that we would always have that kind of engagement. Yeah. We'd always have that kind of dialogue. We would always be working with people to ask them what they thought rather than to say, here's what I think. And that was the hardest thing for me to understand as a politician, as a media guy, as a reporter, was to listen. Yeah. Because most of the time we don't listen. We think we have the strategy, and we don't get that validation from the public. And until the public buys it, you can't move forward. And that was where I really think is the problem even today. We don't spend enough time to have that communication, nor do we invest the dollars that we need to have for that kind of communication so that we can really begin to tap the nerve and tap where people need to be.
That's great. Do you want to jump in on that?
Well, I think there's something in particular that Norm just said that is really worth underlining, and that is this: he thought about asking the right question. Which is sort of the predicate to listening, right? You got to be committed to listening, but asking the right question is where leadership comes in a way, right? And framing things the way that you all did in those summits that led to the Families and Education Levy. A couple weeks ago, I was in Kansas City, where a group of actually kind of a collective impact type coalition of faith groups, community groups, advocacy organizations of different kinds were coming together for what they called the Moral Economy Summit. And they were focusing in particular around, you may know this, around payday lending, right? And they spent a lot of time in the course of this summit and all the organizing that went on both before the summit and after. You may have noticed in the papers last week, the federal Consumer Financial Protection Bureau actually issued some preliminary rules now cracking down on the payday lending industry. And they did so at a hearing in Kansas City. And that wasn't by accident. It was because there were people on the ground in Kansas City organizing and saying, hey, we're a place in the country that is actually getting people who have long been preyed upon. We are getting them organized. We are listening to them. We are activating them through every channel we can, whether it's faith groups or other groups, military groups, across the political spectrum. And the way they did this was by framing the right question, right? What is a moral economy, right? What does a moral economy look like? Yep. And you know, you can ask that question, and people who are on the social justice left will hear a certain answer, and they'll say, yeah, we got to end payday lending for that. But then people on the evangelical religious right will also be like, yeah, this is against literally the word of God to be this kind of usurious, right? The state of Missouri, the legal limit for interest rates on a payday loan is 1,950%. 1,950%, right? Why is it that high? Because it can be. Yep. Because it can be, right? And that goes back to the thing about power, right? I mean, and what's happening here is that by asking this right question about what does a moral economy look like in the state of Missouri, you're getting people activated, and when you get them activated, you generate the power that is then able to shift the frame of the possible and say to the legislature and say to policymakers, you know what, 1950% is not normal. It is not okay. It is just a half step away from bondage, and we're not going to do that.
So both of your comments, to me, kind of help illuminate something that we should name, which is that you can't really separate the stake in the ground at last year's gathering on equity, or as you say, when we talk about equity, we're talking about inequities, and the stake in the ground around community and constituent voice. Because an elite's understanding of equity and inequity might be very different than a person in a community whose lives they may be making literally life and death decisions about. So let's rehash that. Now we're back to one larger stake. And I think your power analysis and that we should always start with that is in many ways connecting those two dots. Go ahead, Norm.
I think when we were going through this process in the Family and Education Levy, it didn't go into how many more teachers or class size or the like. I said earlier, how do you make children safe, healthy, and ready to learn? Everybody's child, safe, healthy, and ready to learn. What are those investments? By creating a healthy child is an alert child that can learn. Safe, the passage from home to school and back and around there. Those kinds of things are the core values, that you really look at. What we were able to do is begin to make people not see that we were blaming any one of those institutions for the problem, but we saw every institution as a contributor. And then what we did is we asked every corporation to step up to those terms and see what they could do. And that began to frame everything differently so that the next levy and the way in which we went back to deal with education had that collaborative effort without really having to just do a clarion call. But people saw real things they could do. The more you can get the community involved, engaged in doing those things, we were able to really make headway as we moved through there. And then what I learned a lot in that whole process from being an old style politician to a new style politician, you don't have to know it all, but you have to hear it. And you have to listen. And if people know that you listen, I had more people say, you listen to us. And I think we sometimes think that we can do something for the community without understanding that they can do it themselves. And that's the key, is making sure, because once they do it, they own it. And then passing on new levies, getting dollars, bond issues, other kinds of things, it's pretty easy to move forward because they felt like they did it.
Just as we pivot to you, Eric, it occurs to me, one is I did a lousy job of introducing both of you, so I appreciate your ability to weave in your past. But in a lot of ways, Norm, what the story you're telling describes how you, in many ways, here in Seattle became a beloved mayor and a mayor who's known for civic engagement, and your work at the university followed on that. I think you ended up the CEO of the Seattle Foundation in part because of your ability to listen and to broker between those with extra resources and those who needed access to those resources.
And with the Seattle Foundation, the framework of the Seattle Foundation, not that was through me, but through Phyllis Campbell and others, the healthy community. What makes a healthy community? What are those elements that make a healthy community? And then working with donors and the like to begin to see the opportunities for their philanthropy to invest in those areas and broker those kinds of interests.
And then to segue to Eric, your point about that, the famous poem by Lao Tzu that ends with, and in the end, the people should say they did it themselves. Right. And in some ways, it's based on that power analysis that Ernie Cortez, the legendary organizer from IAF, says there's an iron rule beyond the golden rule. The iron rule is never do for others what they can do for themselves. And you, I think, led this city in a way that allowed people to see that they could be agents in their own change. And related to that is the right question. You said the right question that helped pass the levy was about all our children. Your whole life is about asking the right question. In fact, in a lot of ways, your new initiative at the Aspen Institute is really based on one question, which I believe the question is, who is us? Am I right? Can you talk about how you would apply that question to the work of deep community change as resourced by philanthropy? I mean, do you want to tell us a little bit about this question?
Sure.
Why does that keep you up? And
Well, you talk about Ernie Cortez, I would invoke another great organizer, Marshall Gans, who many of you know has this kind of 3 circles framework of organizing through story, right? The story of self, the story of us,
Right.
and the story of now, right? And those three things align. And if you can get those 3 things to align, you will be successful at organizing, you will be successful at leading, you'll be successful at listening, you'll be successful in doing things that are about collective impact, right? And that middle story, the story of us, right? Not just the story of self and kind of what are you feeling right now, but the story of us, begs this larger question: who's us, right? And what Steve's referring to is a project that I'm doing out of the Aspen Institute that is really trying to explore in the American context what we mean when we say us. And we don't need to belabor the point about this election season and this presidential campaign and the ways in which there are very starkly competing pictures in people's minds, both citizens and candidates, right, about who is us and who is American and who doesn't count as American, right? But put aside the national scale, again, just back at the level of your block or a neighborhood or a given city, the question of how do you create a shared sense of fate? How do you create a shared sense of identity? And I think part of that has to be about recognizing the ways in which our fates are so completely entwined, right? I want to be very clear. When I talked about power earlier, many times people hear the word power and immediately they hear, oh, this is stuff that I want to kind of keep at arm's length because it's about domination, it's about top down, it's about bossing people.
Something I won't have.
Or something I won't have, right? But it's this kind of very either or zero sum kind of deal. Everything that Norm just talked about and of course practiced in office was about a different kind of power. Everything that Ernie Cortez does in the world and Marshall Gans does in the world is about a different story of power, and that is the power that arises from people participating and stepping into their full civic identities and their full civic potential, right? People not just being atomized little voiceless consumers, but actually feeling like, hey, I kind of own this place. I kind of run this place. I kind of, in the best sense, I'm kind of responsible for this place. And our ability to create a sense of that shared responsibility and identity is, I think, at the heart of this other kind of power, which is not about domination. It is about opening up I'm going to refer a book to all of you that I just love, and maybe you read it. It's called Bonds That Make Us Free, by a guy named C. Terry Warner, who is a professor at BYU, I believe, and organizational psychology, and he runs this big center that examines just human dynamics at every scale, whether it's a relationship with a spouse or a partner, or life in a neighborhood or a community, or conflicts between nations, right? And the dynamic he finds at every scale is this: we as humans accuse others in order to excuse ourselves. That's it. We accuse others in order to excuse ourselves. And that's true of everything from, why didn't you do the dishes? Well, why didn't you do take out the garbage, right? To things that go on in national politics and so forth. And when you see that dynamic, and you see the ways in which it gets us stuck in so much brokenness in our politics, but also in our work of trying to build and heal community, what Warner talks about is the way to unlock that is simply to say, I caused this as much as you did. Yeah. Is to basically, when I say that I own my part of this, it releases you to say, no, I own a part of it too. Yeah. And it creates this freedom, right? That taking responsibility liberates you. And that, I know that's a little bit spiritual and not so much about the kind of policy side of things, but I think it is fundamental to how we have to think about, that's a very specific kind of power, right? That's not the power to divvy up stuff or to keep some people down. That is the power of basically saying, we're connected here whether we want to admit it or not, and so I may as well be the first one to admit it.
I always tell everybody the most powerful moment in George Bush's presidency was Ground Zero. Mm-hmm. If you recall, he went to Ground Zero to speak to the construction workers on that big pile of debris, and the bullhorn didn't work, and they all were yelling at him saying, we can't hear you. We can't hear you. And in that one moment he said, but I can hear you. And it changed the dialogue for his administration, for the way that people responded, because you can hear. You can hear. It's really so much the art of listening and then responding with a plan, and not so much a plan that here's what I'm going to do for you, but now that I hear you, will you help me? Now that I hear you, will you engage? And that's civic engagement. Will you engage with me to make it happen? And I'll be with you all the way. Sometimes I think the biggest thing with government is we won't give the resources for engagement. Mm-hmm. We somehow think that engagement comes somewhere else, and you need to pay for that. And not in the sense of community organizing or the like, but you've got to give people the skills. I mean, if you're going to ask people who are working 50 hours a week to be engaged in a strategy for education, then you better have daycare. Mm-hmm. You better have some food at those meetings. You better make sure that you're showing people that not only do I want you there, I understand where you are, and I'm willing to do the things to make you be an active participant, not just somebody who listens. Mm-hmm. I think that was the hardest thing for me. I was finance and budget chair for the city of Seattle, so they used to tease me and say, scratch Norm Rice and you find a banker. I really had to change that attitude, that it isn't just the bottom line, it's the heart, it's your soul. It's about making sure people understand you're connecting to them on a level that is real and honest and genuine. And I had to lose 2 elections to find my soul, so to speak. But it was the thing that was really important, because it isn't going to some great school of government. It's not really public affairs and public administration. It's really getting up, walking those streets, into those neighborhoods, showing people that you can relate to what they're doing and willing to roll up your sleeves to help them.
Great.
You know, Norm was no longer, he was at the Seattle Foundation by this time, but there was a period during which I served on the Seattle Public Library Board of Trustees, and it was just my dumb luck to arrive on the board at the time when a giant $200 million bond measure had recently passed in the city, and there was a question of essentially, you know, what are we going to do with that, right? And one thing was to build what is now this gorgeous new downtown central library.
There's an event there.
Check it out if you haven't, if you're from
during
out
the
of town,
conference. be
must
there.
go.
Yeah.
But also, you know, 26 neighborhood branches, right? And that process, which I arrived on the board at just as it was getting underway, was, you know, I've worked, as Steve said, I've worked in Washington, D.C., I've been in different kind of precincts of power. I've never had a better education in democracy than my time on the Seattle Public Library Board, and particularly that period during that implementation of the Libraries for All measure. Because what we did was, in dozens of neighborhoods around this city, we started doing it was kind of hokey, but we called them hopes and dreams meetings. Right? It's just literally what Norm just described, going into communities and not just kind of going in with a standard template of here's how our meeting's going to go, but going, and if you were going to be in the International District, you'd have a meeting, you know, in the right languages and with the right, you know, translation. If you're going to do it, you know, over in Beacon Hill, same thing. If you're going to do it, you know, but doing these hopes and dreams meetings that were sincerely asking residents of the neighborhood, what are your hopes and dreams for this new library branch we get to build? What do you want? Do you, you know, and it's not just the asking then, it's actually showing that we heard you and we will reflect what you've said here into the plans, and then, you know, when the day comes, X number of months later, when you actually build and open that branch, they own it. They own it in a sense that isn't just I paid for it. They own it in the sense that, hey, that was my idea.
We built it ourselves.
To do this thing or to have this set of materials here. I said that, right?
Exactly.
Who was responsible for those crazy glass angles? Anyway, it was really cool, but you'll have to go see the building. So just some other stakes in the ground that I heard you guys just put down. One was around the spiritual, which is, you know, I think there's the Greek, the etymology of the word philanthropy is love of humanity, and maybe that's connected to the idea of really listening of the spiritual side. I think you also touched even further on the power question, and I think it's an important one to raise. This came up in the opening plenary where Ken Thompson raised it from the Gates Foundation very clearly, said there's some power dynamics that we have to be aware of going into this work. Then also the idea of the community capacity, and where I'm taking us on this is civic infrastructure, and that, you know, tomorrow we'll have I think what will be an incredible panel, which includes William Bell. You sit on the Casey family board, and William Bell often says that for this kind of deep change, and Michael Brown on the earlier panel said, yeah, we're not that far into it. We're only 6 or 7 years into the roadmap project. So, you know, we're early stage, which, you know, I think is a real triumph actually for this movement, because, you know, 1 year, 3 year grant cycles don't reflect that. And what William says is you can't solve these sort of deep institutional challenges. You can't solve them on a election timeline, and you can't solve them on a grant-making timeline, and that you have to be in it for the long haul, especially in the context of collective impact, where there is a backbone role, and essentially the idea of the backbone is that it is those folk who wake up every day trying to connect the systems and make the systems work, so they can't be necessarily from any of those systems. How do we think about this question of election cycles and grant-making cycles as not congruent to the kind of deep life cycle change you're trying to make in community with collective impact? Any thoughts about that? A former elected, a former White House official?
I guess I look at it 2 ways. There are several initiatives besides the education initiative that we had in the city of Seattle, but the principles of it, of getting the community engaged in forming it and developing those initiatives, whether they were for environmental stewardship, economic opportunity, or the like. As you bring people there, you can even in the scarce resources of a city, redeploy resources to help people build what they need to have. And the hardest thing in the world is to make sure that people buy into the principles: social equity, economic opportunity, environmental stewardship. And one of the things that we tried to do was to make sure that whatever we did, you had to address those things. I don't care if it's the engineering department, I don't care if it's the police department. How does this appeal to those kinds of things, so that no matter where you are, people are out there making that kind of discussion with the community. The community will do a lot more things than you think, and they can also take a little less if they know that you asked them. But if you say, here's what I did for you, you will see them go south on you faster than anything you ever wanted to. But if they can see how they can build, or I like to say, if they can see their faces in the things that you're doing, they'll back you all the way. But if they can't see you in the people that you hire, in the people that are building it, they can't see their faces there, then you've lost a whole lot of faith.
There's a couple of questions actually in your question, and one aspect of it is about one is the time cycles, so election cycles versus grant making cycles, and so on and so forth. And let's come back to that, because there was a thing you said a moment ago earlier that really I've been chewing on here.
I'm supposed to be moderating, by the way.
Yeah, no, but this is really interesting. I mean, this question of how do you, I forget the phrasing you used earlier, but when you just talked about the ways in which civic infrastructure.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a phrase, that's a term that basically only nerds like us use, right?
You.
Yeah, right? I mean, who out in the world talks about civic infrastructure, right? People don't even talk about physical infrastructure. That's just it's a wonky way to come at it, right? And so I think if we can kind of verbify nouns like that, like instead of talking about civic infrastructure, like what are the actions involved in when you talk about civic infrastructure? What you're talking about are, ways of listening to people and ways of building trust. You're talking about spaces where people feel like they can air their grievances, hash out compromises. You're talking about a variety of things, right? That's number one, I think, is just that this idea of civic infrastructure still comes down to actions that we have to take, right? And so it's really worth kind of making a list of the verbs of what those actions are. What are things that we have to do rather than objects we need to build, right?
We had to deal with that on a growth management plan. The legislature passed a growth management plan, and everybody had to come up with a growth. Well, going to a community meeting to talk about the growth management and density and the like, people said, what are you talking about? So once again, we had to go back and say, what do you like about the community that you have? And how do we now keep it, preserve it, or build on it? And after a while, we came back to the issues of social equity. We came back to the environmental stewardship. We came back to the kinds of things that people could say, this plan addresses the hopes and dreams and aspirations of my community, and therefore I'll support it. They probably wouldn't know anything about height, density, or anything, but they knew that they were going to be a part of building it, and they understood that you listened to them. And I think that's the biggest thing with anything in government and all. If you can't show you heard them, you can't have the support you need for your bond issues, for the dollars that you need to build those kinds of things.
Norm, is it any different for philanthropy then? If, in government, you have to show you hear them. We talked a lot about the lack of accountability in philanthropy in the earlier panel.
I think that's the biggest debate you have to have. So sometimes I used to think people, when I was with the foundation, that Norm Rice is too touchy-feely, and we need outcomes, and we need measures, and we need all these kinds of things. I believe in those kinds of things, but sometimes we can get so far away that in philanthropy, we want those outcomes so intense and so measured that we lose the face of the people we're trying to help. And you've got to make sure that you keep that face there, not just the metrics and the statistics and the reports. Can you see their faces? Can you hear their voices? And if you can, you know you're on the right track. It's about leadership, and I guess I'm a little too soulful. That's probably why I'm not a politician anymore. But you know what? You gotta show people that you understand that pain, or you understand that aspiration. And if you can't do it, I don't care how good you have dollars or anything else, you lose that connection. And once you lose that connection, you can't build anything.
There's two, actually they both start with the letter I, but it's not talking about I like itself. Two things that I think are really important here that come up in this conversation. One is the idea of invitation, and the other is the idea of interest, right? So invitation, like again, back to these summits or hopes and dreams meetings or whatever, the question for anybody, whether you're in philanthropy or government or just in other forms of civic life, is how do you extend an invitation that is sincere to other people to participate? It's kind of that, like, how do you extend a sincere invitation? Not an invitation that is meant to look like I'm extending an invitation, right? But a sincere invitation. And like sitting with that question actually will unpack plenty for you, right? But then the second piece of interest, I think, which, you know, when you ask people in the context of growth management or something, or in the context of libraries, you know, what do you want? Yeah, you know, people initially will answer from a sense of self-interest. Well, I want more of this thing that I like or that I need, right? And this comes back to the story of us idea. We have to start telling a story of mutual interest. That, in fact, that all interest, that true self-interest is mutual interest, right? And this idea...
You wrote a book about that. One of your 4 or 5 books, I got to name those, touched on that.
But I think this idea of interest, I really want to underscore it because, again, if we're going to be real about philanthropy and about collective impact, it means being real about power. And being real about power means recognizing that people have different interests, and those interests will often come into conflict, not just sit adjacent to one another, but they'll be in conflict. And they may or may not be zero-sum conflicts, but people will think they are zero-sum conflicts, and they'll act that way, right? And so we've got to figure out how do we tell a story that says, actually, there's win-wins here to be had, right? And that's you know, yes, good politicians know how to do that, but good philanthropists know how to do that, right? And good neighbors know how to do it as well.
In the village, who's the most revered? The storyteller. The storyteller captures your hopes, your dreams, your past, and they articulate it to that community, and it's what builds the soul of a community. And one of the things I think that's hard for people to do is that you gotta say, I heard you. And here's how I'm going to, you don't have to say, I'm doing what you said you want. You gotta say, you said, and here's how I'm going to do this. And then somebody says, you listen to me. But if you just come in and say, guess what, I got the best plan in the world for this community, take it, they'll go south on you in a minute. You know what I mean? And then you wonder what happened. You gotta tell that story, and you gotta say you heard it, and you gotta say, here's how I want to do this. Because nobody thinks that you're gonna do everything that they say, but they are gonna say, you listened to us. And if they can hear that you listened, then they will buy a lot of what you want to do. But if they feel like you never listened and you left them out, you will fail. You will fail.
There are 2 people who many of you in this room may know or know of who exemplify a lot of what we're talking about. One is a woman named Ai-jen Poo, who founded and created a thing called the National Domestic Workers Alliance, organizing essentially a largely immigrant, largely female workforce of domestic workers of all kinds, right? And who have no...
Did she just get the MacArthur?
She won a MacArthur Genius Fellowship a year or 2 ago. And so she's one person I want to talk about. And then the other, maybe you've crossed paths with Bob Woodson.
Yes.
In Washington, D.C., run something called the Center for Neighborhood Enterprise, right? which operates in DC, Milwaukee, Jersey City, I think a bunch of cities around the United States working in low-income, mainly African-American neighborhoods, and trying to transform them from the inside out, right? Now, the iGen and Bob, politics totally different, right? iGen is a lefty. Bob Woodson is Paul Ryan's mentor on poverty issues and urban issues, right? And so their circles, their politics, very different. But their philosophy is fundamentally the same, which is, in fact, you can hear the language in both of them, from the inside out. That's their whole philosophy, right? It is not about expertise. It is not about infrastructure. It is about like truly going to the neighborhoods, the quote-unquote disadvantaged neighborhoods, and saying, there is capital here that's not being seen or reflected. There are ways that people here solve problems, and we're going to unlock that, and we're going to amplify that, and we're going to add rocket fuel to that, but we're not going to treat these communities and neighborhoods as helpless. And I think, and the same with iGen in the way that she organized a workforce of people who had been voiceless but were not helpless, right? And what she needed to do was to kind of collectivize this sense that all these isolated domestic workers, nannies, and caregivers of different kinds who are literally often in very physically isolated work situations could share with one another what they knew and their learnings and their wisdom about what it would look like to change the nature of their work so that it'd be more respected and so forth, right? That's from the inside out in a way that, I think collective impact has that in its, wants to have that, but I think the more the movement grows, sometimes it does feel more outside in, right? And I think that's got to be a continuous thing we push ourselves to do, is just ask, what's the inside out dimension here,
I really think you really hit on something. The inequity issue in America is by far something we don't know how to talk about and put our arms around, but the more we have that inequity, the greater fear I have. And the fear I have is that suspensions, the cost of suspensions, and especially of young African-American youth, is extraordinary. Is extraordinary, and it costs billions and billions of dollars for children who are suspended and can't get through education. But we don't come back to it to understand what a flawed policy suspension is and what it's going to do for America over time. And so we have a tendency sometimes to want to penalize, punish, without understanding the consequences of those punishments are costs, big costs. And the people are not going to be able to pay for them. And where do you take that debate? I mean, that's probably the next thing that we're trying to talk about is, at the end of the day, what is the cost of neglect? And what is the cost of not doing that? And what will it mean for those neighborhoods, those communities, and the programs you want? You better find the investments.
Just a couple of things. I'm going to open it up for questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and we can close with your ability to interview these two guys. But just on those couple last points, it was interesting the other day I heard Jeff Canada talking about his early collective impact work, if we want to call that collective impact work. And on the topic of suspensions, he actually talked about how they would just pay for lawyers to help their kids out when they got in trouble, because that's what upper middle class kids got, and the public defender wasn't going to quite cut it in the context of overworked caseloads. But the point about sort of investment, he said, I went to all these hearings with all these young men who were in trouble, and I was catching a lot of heat at the time for having a cost per participant of something like $11,000 per kid per year in the Harlem Children's Zone. And his story was, I went to all these things, I never once heard a judge say, I'm going to send you upstate, where it costs $164,000 a year to incarcerate someone in New York, and for 10 years, but I just did the math, and that's not sustainable, or that's not scalable. And he's like, I kept waiting for the judge to say that, and so I think the investment point is right on. The other thing that I heard you mention is in storytelling, where what I think I heard both of you say, which is an interesting thing I think for us to think about in the collective impact space, is in the young men and young people who get suspended and then on school to prison pipeline, there's kind of an effort to flip that and to say that those young people have to be protagonists in their own narrative. And what I've heard you guys say about collective impact and community is that it's actually protagonists not only in their own narrative, but in a shared narrative. Yes. That is what we're trying to achieve. And it's just, you are both master storytellers, and I'd like to give you a round of applause and then turn it over to the community. So thanks to both of you for this. I know it's late, I know the bar is still open, but any questions yes, please, we'll run a mic on up here, and thank you. Raise your hand if you have another question. We'll get the other mic to you while we'll multitask. We don't have a lot of time left. Right there, thank you.
Hello, thank you. My name is Veronica Shepard. I'm with the San Francisco Department of Public Health. And we have a huge collective impact group that we're working with. But I want to really be more intentional with my question to the gentleman in the middle about power. As you were talking, it's ironic that we were talking earlier at the table about me being born and raised in San Francisco, growing up in a historically black community called Bayview Hunters Point. And I was asked, how do you feel about what's going on in your city? And I said, it's very disheartening because the black people are being displaced. We're watching other people come in from all over the world that are making huge amounts of money, and yet we're being invisible. So my question was, as you were talking, I wrote down, particularly from a community lens as an African-American woman, how can African-American people who've been and still are being historically traumatized, intentionally displaced, and systematically kept out of economic growth and elevation have power? How do I, as a grandmother, pass on power that I myself can't access? I think about power and honesty and authenticity and truth, and when I see my own community being erased from an equation and we're getting systematically kicked out or sick and poor and kicked out of school, a lot of people are making money and we're just being erased and we have no power. And I've watched my mother, who is 91 years old, fight and go to meetings and fight and have other community people go to meetings and fight, and we still have no power. Thank you.
You're asking a good question.
Better you than me.
First of all, thank you for sharing your reflections and your experience. And there's no sugarcoating what you just said about, San Francisco, for instance, and Seattle is experiencing quite the same thing. And so there may not be a happy ending in either of our cities for a shrinking African American community that is rapidly getting displaced. And so I don't want to sugarcoat that. At the same time, I think there's a couple things that I heard in what you said that are really worth reflecting back to you. Number one, you work in public health. And I really do believe that everybody, but particularly everybody who wants to become a bit more fluent in power, needs to think like an epidemiologist, needs to think like someone who works in public health, which is to say, needs to think in terms of contagions, right? And network maps and nodes of networks, right? That's what you all do in public health, right? And most of the time in public health, that's being done to prevent harms, the spread of, the flu or gun violence or HIV or whatever, and everybody has their maps of that, right? And I think part of what you have, just literally you, is you have a set of skills and a mindset and a way of seeing in networks that is a tremendous asset, and that sounds like you already deploy that in service of your city generally and the African American community in particular, but I think that is an asset that, that's something I would want you to pass on, not only to your grandchildren, but to everybody who you can grab in listening distance, right? Learn how to see in networks and learn how to try to kind of identify where you can put pressure on what nodes, right? And maybe now in your neighborhood in San Francisco, I don't know how done the battle is, and maybe there's still something to preserve, but in general, in life, that is a set of skills and a way of seeing that I think, number one, is really worth something. The second thing that you said that I think is also really, just everything you said that is really important, it goes back to story and what Norm had to say, right? People talk about in Seattle and in San Francisco, they talk about gentrification, and they talk about displacement, right? And these are as impersonal and structural a set of things as civic infrastructure, right? And when you humanize that story, you didn't do it in any particular dramatic way. You didn't tell me about an eviction or a heart-rending scene on a street corner or anything like that. You just told me about this slow erosion of presence and visibility that is soul-crushing, right? And I heard that, and I felt that, and I feel that, and I think that's a story that it can and must be amplified not only in the ecosystem of the Bay Area, but in the country, right? And we have to start asking ourselves, as we are asking ourselves in Seattle, we ask ourselves in Seattle, do we want to become San Francisco, right? And
if we aren't already.
If we aren't already, right? And again, the way to ask that question is through stories like yours. And so the last thing I'll say is just, while not sugarcoating, is you are more powerful than you think. You are more powerful than you know, right? You individually, and you as someone embedded in a collective and in a network and a set of circles, right? And I'm not preaching at you, and I'm not trying to give you a self-help pep talk. I'm just saying you have no idea the kinds of assets that other people, that you may take for granted, and other people would be like, what? What did you mean? How do you do that? How did you make that door open? How did you connect those dots? How did you paint that picture, right? And I think that is a set of things that, if you can help amplify that in the remnant of the African American community in San Francisco, it'll be a great thing.
I think she wants you to help her buff up her resume,
right.
too. After that. She was like, Norm, and then we have another question, and I think we're close.
I probably am a little more pessimistic. I really believe that we are, whether we say it or not, fighting for the soul of America. And the equity issue that's facing America is huge. And it's not as easily solved, because everybody has that one thing they want or need, and they're not always compatible. So what are you going to do? Not you, I mean, that's the question in America. Who are you going to help? And who are you going to bring along? And how are you going to bring them along? And what are you going to do to solve it? And that's in education, that's in jobs, that's in wages and the like. And interesting enough, politicians are smart enough to know how to attract a constituency to be for that. But sometimes, I always say, do you see your face in the constituencies they're talking to? And are you going to bring us all along? Because even on wages, and even a living wage is not equitable for everybody, even though some people think it is. So what we have to do is we've got to challenge everyone and not look at anyone as the sole champion of our dreams and our aspirations. Everyone who's running for anything should be challenged, and everyone should be asked, what are you going to do to make this journey better? And not anyone can ride the tides of I'm your champion and they're not. Because in their own ways, the special interests of equity is as diffuse as anything else you want to see. And so it's not as easy to say, well, I'm going to vote for this person, I'm going to vote for that person, they're going to do something for me. We've got to challenge every one of them about what is it specifically you're talking about, not the generalities, not the kinds of things that fit on a campaign slogan. but and then what have you done? Because that's the other thing. A lot of us can champion a whole lot of things, but at the end of the day, what's your record as it relates to the things that you say?
I have to just add
If
one
I
note
can't,
here.
well, let me
to-
just
to
say,
challenge-
but if I can't see my face in the people who are supporting you, I'm not there. And you need to make sure you're showing me that I can get in the door with you and take this journey and challenge you.
The word that Norm just said that is super important for all of you is challenge. And I want to challenge you actually to think about either yourselves or in who you support, whether through funding or otherwise, to be open to a wider spectrum of challenge, an impolite spectrum of challenge, right? This is a pretty establishment group right here, and this is a fairly establishment group right here, right? But one of my former students, Edwin Lindo, was one of the 5 people who got known as the Frisco Five, who went on a 17-day hunger strike in your city to draw attention to police brutality and to the continued killing of unarmed citizens of color in San Francisco. And they had a very specific challenge and demand, which was they wanted the removal of the police chief, right? And you can like or not like their tactics. You can feel uncomfortable if you want to about the issues and say it's more complicated than that. But as Frederick Douglass says, power concedes nothing without a demand. And sometimes that demand can be done politely and through politics, traditional politics, and sometimes that demand is going to be done through social movements and protest and direct action. And we got to get comfortable with that if we're serious about collective action.
Yeah,
right?
sometimes that demand can come from a really good grant agreement. maybe not. Let's segue to the last question and then the closing comments so you guys can
I'm
weave
afraid
into that.
it's not a question, but I join the mayor in having a sense of pessimism. I'm from Staten Island, New York, where a tremendous amount of development is going on. And New York has a progressive mayor. You've got to figure that he's going to be on the right side of an issue. So at a recent public meeting, and I'm thinking of this lady's mother's going to meeting after meeting and doing all the things that the leaders tell you to do when you want to have input and protest. And I'm sitting next to an older African American woman. I guess she might have been in her late 70s, early 80s. She had been
She's
at all the
young. She's
meetings. And she kept mumbling, gentrification, gentrification. And the people running the meeting, primarily white agency leaders, all said, oh yes, gentrification, like it was a good thing. Mm-hmm. And this lady didn't think gentrification was good at all. And so the city is checking off the boxes. They're having their community meetings and they're inviting. But I think, Erica, of your comment about an invitation that's authentic and then having a track record, so you can have all the community input you want on paper, but if it's not authentic, it just doesn't matter.
So I think that was a question mark on the end there, and that's helpful. So let's just use that, and I think it's a worthwhile to go to closing comments. I will take the prerogative of the moderator to jump into this conversation by saying, I vacillate back and forth from despair, especially when I think about the criminal justice system in America. We incarcerate more African American men than black men were incarcerated during the height of apartheid. I get real angst, and I'm just remembering having caught a little bit of the president's graduation speech at Howard University, and he said to those Howard graduates, many of you are young, going into your careers, and you're very you feel a sense of despair about your future. And maybe even some cynicism as you look at the national political scene, et cetera. And his message was, what decade do you want to be in? You tell me, what decade do you want to be in? Do you want to be 10 years back? Do you want to be here when Thurgood Marshall was a student here? Or even when Ta-Nehisi Coates was a student here? I think you want to be graduating here, now, today, in this decade. And so I think as you think about gains in the civil rights movement, in the GLBT community, et cetera, there is some reason for hope, and there is always going to be struggle. I'm not trying to downplay the heightened inequity in our society right now. I'm just trying to say, when you look at the next generation, I'm pretty hopeful about those Howard graduates. I think they're going to change the world in a really positive way and address some of this inequity. What do you guys say?
My hopeful statement, even though I start out being pessimistic, battles are constant. They have to be fought over and over again. I'm sorry, they're never over. And if you understand that they're a constant and they have to be fought over and over, you can still have hope because you know what you need to do, rather than to say it's over and I don't have to worry about that or it's somebody else's problem. It's a constant. You have to always be reminded. It's sort of like as a politician, you got to get up every week and walk those streets. You can't just stay in that castle or place you are. You got to walk the street, talk to people, look them in the eye, shake their hand, understand what's going on. And then when you go back to the meetings where you're dealing with policy, you have a better perspective than a whole bunch of people coming with you with a whole lot of ideas saying, here's what you ought to be, here's what we're doing for those people. You are those people, so therefore you need to be out there with the people forming the policy and listening to them, their hopes, their fears, their dreams, their aspirations.
You know, I am optimistic in this sense. I mean, I think it's not just what President Obama said and, you know, what decade would you rather be living in, but it's also the sense that, look, we have for all of the noise and anguish and pain that's in our political culture right now, I look at that and I hear that's people who still believe you can change something. I'll get worried when it's really quiet, right? Like it's really quiet in Russia, and it's pretty quiet in, you know, Beijing, right? People don't feel a whole lot like if they rile things up and make a stir and, you know, make noise, that maybe they could change something, right? And so I'm talking across the board. I mean, whether you're talking about Bernie Sanders supporters, Donald Trump supporters, all points between, you know, Black Lives Matter, Dreamers, you know, name your movement right now. This is an incredible time, seen not since basically, you know, the late 60s, of the ferment of all of these social movements. And it's accelerated by technology, but it's also accelerated by this sense that, yeah, we're making progress and it's not enough, right? And I think that is, to me, something, there's something there. There's something for us to grab onto, which is that people still believe that change is possible. And our responsibility for those of us who think about, you know, collective impact and how do we change lives on the ground and change the situation on the ground, I think that I think often about the Highlander Folk School, which some of you know. So Rosa Parks did not just suddenly one day decide, I'm tired and I'm not going to get up from my seat on the bus, right? She was tired, but Rosa Parks had been trained. Rosa Parks had gone to the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee to be trained not only in a range of nonviolent civil disobedience, but in a whole range of things about what you would now call collective impact. They didn't have the jargon then, but it was, believe me, it was collective impact they were talking about. You know, all the same things: shared goal, common measures, continuous communication, backbone networks, you know, all of the CI stuff was what they were talking about at Highlander Folk School, where they trained this generation of civil rights workers and civil rights activists, right? And out of that ecosystem emerged Rosa Parks. And our job right now is to be making sure in 100 different ways, all over the place, there are Highlander Folk Schools popping up or surviving or sustaining or connecting.
It's still there, by the way.
Highlander's still there,
Highlander's still there.
right? And we are all responsible for being volunteer teachers or creators at our own Highlander Folk Schools. And that's going to be the thing that converts this moment right now that is, I believe, fertile, not overripe, but fertile, you know, and convert it into something that is productive for the country.
So, in summary, get out and walk around, make some noise. That's what I heard. And let's thank these guys for a great conversation. Thank you both.